without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's first speaker, Robin Clayton, Director with Ipsos UU. Robin, you have the floor.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're going to turn off the video now and get started. We appreciate you giving us your time. We know it's in short supply, and so very briefly, we'll go through a quick agenda and then get started. So why are we here? We're here to help you understand how we make our brands work across different cultures. And one of the ways in which we'll do that is we're going to look at why and how culture matters, particularly in a time of crisis. And then we'll also talk about how to understanding culture can lead to better outcomes. And you'll see that across kind of COVID-19 itself and some of the challenges we faced there with the pandemic, and also for your brands. And then we'll have a short Q&A. So if you have questions, please feel free to send them in while we're chatting, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. So just kick off, we wanted to kind of ground everybody in a single definition of culture and how we think about culture when we're looking at it for this type of work. And so in that case, culture is a shared social values that are driving individual behavior. And that includes the minutia of everyday life. So what we perceive as breakfast food, for example, and you can see here two very different examples of what breakfast might look at, depending on the culture in which you're in. It's things like humor and how that resonates as well. But it's also widely shared beliefs about big things. So not just the little things, but the larger concerns. Things like how we think about marriage and family and gender roles. And so to sum it up, it's how we think about the world and how we make sense of our world. And most of the time when we think of culture, we think about country to country, right? So we think about the USA having a distinct culture versus a China versus Brazil versus all of the different places in the world. But culture actually forms the core of different societies and goes beyond countries. So it's things like geographic regions within a country, right? So how urban is versus rural versus a coastal kind of mindset. It can be looked at on a generational basis or a demographic basis. And it can also be about segmentation. So the segmentation that you have for your brands, or things like early adopters versus laggards. Those all have distinct kind of cultural elements, and understanding those can help us understand the choices that they're making. The reason that we look at culture and why it matters is it's like anything else. If we can understand it, we can learn from it. And if we can learn from it, we can impact decisions that consumers are making and drive actions. And there are three kind of core reasons that we focus on for why that is. One is that culture is deeply embedded. So while attitudes and behaviors react to change, culture and values tend to stay fairly steady. It's not that they never change, but they're not changing as rapidly, as much, as quickly, and as dramatically. And cultural analysis, when you combine it with local market understanding, is important when you're trying to understand and influence action. One of the other reasons is that culture can help reveal our priorities, particularly in a time of crisis. It helps to expose and open up even more than in a time where we're not facing something as dramatic as COVID-19. What values might be a little less secure and a little less steady, and those that can be transformed based on what's going on in the world. And also, if we can understand culture and learn from it, we can get hints at what may be next, or take a look at what's happening in another place or another culture and see how it might impact ours. So for example, with COVID-19, when it was starting out, the pandemic, we could kind of see it start to move across the world. And you could look and see what was happening in a place like China and how people were reacting and what that meant for brands and the actions that were being taken. And you could, if you understood what was driving that from a cultural perspective, map it to the cultural perspective of another location and start to see what might transfer and what might be different. And then again, how you might impact it. So it gives us a way to learn from other places if we understand, again, kind of those core motivations and values. But what happens to culture in a time of crisis, right? Certainly we have seen, and I don't think anyone would disagree with the idea that COVID-19 has impacted things dramatically. We have a wide range of behaviors, and these just represent a few that you see here on the screen, of things that have changed that we've had to alter based on the reality of what we're facing. And so what does that mean for culture? If we're having this dramatic change, does culture really still, carry the value that it once did? And what we would tell you is that we believe it becomes even stronger in a time of crisis. And that's, again, goes back to that core understanding of what culture is. It's what we turn to in a time of crisis for a couple of reasons. One of those is around the idea or around the ideas of anxiety and uncertainty. Culture is what we look to help us cope with that anxiety. It's what's familiar and helps us kind of provide meaning in a moment of uncertainty. And again, remember, culture drives behavior. And so during a time of crisis, it becomes even stronger. And that happens not only on a system 1, but also on a system 2 kind of basis. And so we see it impact the choices that are made and the decisions that people are making. And to show that, we have kind of for you 3 illustrations from the pandemic. We'll talk about for culture too, one of the ways that we help share the findings and the learnings and the realities of culture is always through illustrations. And so we have 3 for you around how we feel, how we react, and how we communicate that are linked to the crisis that we're all in the midst of still today. So when you think about how people feel, again, we go back to that idea of anxiety and uncertainty. And Ipsos has been tracking that as we watch these kind of waves happen or we watch the spread of COVID across countries. And this is an example from May, but we continue to do this on a regular basis. And you can see here that different countries have a different sense and level of anxiety. And that's important to understand. And some of that goes to where they are in the pandemic and what the reality of their situation currently is. But what it also relates back to, and what culture tells us, is that there are some places where people are more comfortable with that concept of unknowing, of not knowing, right? So there are countries like the UK or the US where there's a little more ease with not knowing what may be coming around the corner, versus some other countries that have a much higher need for certainty. They want reassurance from their government, from brands, to help overcome that level of anxiety. And so knowing that helps us, again, kind of understand what maybe the communication needs to be and how it should be messaged. Another way that we've seen this throughout the pandemic is how we've reacted to some of its challenges. Certainly masking has been kind of top of mind for different cultures, and we've seen different levels of people, feeling how they feel about having to wear a mask, and then ultimately its adoption. And in this case, we've kind of taken the US and Japan as the 2 kind of countries of comparison here. And we've looked at a specific area of culture, which is relationships. And within that, you can see some of the vectors that we might examine when looking at how relationships play out in the 2 countries. And one of those vectors is the individual versus the collective. And you can see that Japan's is much farther along on the collective side versus the US, which is on the individual side. And we've seen in Japan that collectiveness translated to an easier acceptance of the need for masking and a faster adoption and a higher adoption, because they understood, or it's a culture that has kind of that understanding of the idea of it's not just about me, it is about the needs of others as well. And again, that mask message has been, right, it's not just that it protects you, it protects other people as well. In the US, it's more on the individual end. And so it's been a little bit more of a tricky message to get across and to get people enrolled in some cases. We've also seen it in terms of how leaders have communicated the needs and the response that is needed as we face the pandemic. And these examples are from early on when the pandemic was first rolling out and most countries were going into some form or type of lockdown. And you can see that we have an example from France where it was a war metaphor that was used that shaped the messaging that the government used. And part of that is about the fact that France is a country where freedom is an underlying fundamental right. And so to curtail that freedom, being told to stay home, you needed something that made that permissible for the government to feel like they could do that. And so it became a collective call to arms against an invisible enemy. And you have the president of France become kind of that leader who is rallying the troops. And on the other side, you have a culture like India, which has a tradition that's more about subverting rules and a high degree of comfort in terms of leaving things to fate. It's also a huge population, right? And it's a very diverse population. So communicating the important message of staying home and maintaining social distancing, the prime minister instead used a very simple metaphor from a famous mythologic epic that's familiar to everyone across that culture. If you have a couple minutes, we would suggest that you look it up. We don't have time to share the whole the myth, but it's a really interesting one, and it's based on this idea about a line of containment. And it's a metaphor that culture understands, irrespective of their differences. And it achieved what, perhaps a numeric argument wouldn't, in that it implicitly referenced the consequences of breaching a line of containment that's part of this very well-known story. And so in this case, you have the prime minister in the role of benevolent patriarch, and he's invoking that idea of a need for discipline and sacrifice from his citizens versus rallying the troops to war. And you can see those are very distinct and different messages, but both did what they needed to do for their individual cultures because they appealed, again, to those cultural understandings and norms. Excuse me. Culture gives us knowledge and gives brands power even beyond a time of crisis. So we've shared some examples from what's going on with COVID-19, but it's relevant beyond that. In terms of understanding unifying threads and differences that define culture, because then that allows us to navigate the different challenges that brands have to answer. And you can see a couple of them here. So it's everything from understanding whether the essence of your brand will adapt to different cultures, from aligning internal stakeholders. And that may not even be if you have stakeholders in different countries. It may be if you have stakeholders who are, again, in different regions of the country. And so who have kind of a different view of some of the challenges that are being faced. And it allows you to know what nuances are going to be most important and to keep those nuances without losing the core essence. So it's not about kind of flattening something so that it works for everyone. It's about making sure that it works for everyone in the way that it needs to while still maintaining that kind of core that's true to the brand itself. Culture also impacts brands, again, at multiple places and multiple stages. And it really kind of underpins everything that's being done. And you can see here again, kind of the different places where it may come into play and where it may be most critical as you're working through brand and product and communication development. Again, in terms of making sure things work locally and making sure that you're maximizing the assets that the brand has and that the strategy is going to work for everyone across all of the different cultures and types of cultures that it needs to. And when we talk about where you might apply cultural analysis, again, we look at multiple places, and it really depends on kind of the specific challenge your brand is facing. It could be positioning or communication or innovation, but we look at it from the standpoint of cultural knowledge giving power to brands. And again, knowing those unifying threads and those unique differences that define culture are going to help us navigate them seamlessly and answer the challenges that brands face. And in understanding kind of where those differences and similarities are, we can also start to find the points where the brand can activate very specifically with those cultures and get the results and the actions that they're looking to have taken. And one of the examples we'd share with you, and again, this is from the COVID crisis itself. Some of you may have actually seen this. There is a video on YouTube that you can look up where someone took kind of all of the different messaging that was done at the start of this crisis by different brands when they were talking about how they were going to help different communities and groups. And it gets labeled under this, it gets kind of understood under this label now as COVID clutter. And the reason for that is if you watch this video, it highlights how very similar all of those messages ended up being. From somber piano music and telling people we're in this together, and the theme of uncertain times, right? There were kind of core messages that kept getting repeated no matter who the advertiser was, no matter what the brand was. And there was nothing fundamentally wrong with that or incorrect about what was being shared, but it became this kind of indistinguishable mass of messaging. And so no one really stood out, or a lot of people didn't stand out. And so what culture would allow you to do, or what we would say allows you to do, is make sure that when you have that moment, that you're able to not only talk about, the functional benefits that are going to be important and how they're important, but also kind of tap into those social responsibilities and the kind of needs that people are having, the emotional needs as well. And we did have people, and we do have examples where when exploring culture, people did a good job and avoided kind of some of these missteps. And there's an example that we have that comes from, again, from China in this case, with Eminem, who focused on more of an educational video, but the messaging behind it was focused on the concept of solidarity and their solidarity with the people and the people's solidarity with each other. And again, if you have that cultural understanding of China, you know that solidarity is a core fundamental piece of what makes that culture and what people go back to, again, in a time of crisis and a time where they need culture to help them deal with anxiety and uncertainty. And so, again, understanding the role your brand can play in helping consumers cope with their uncertainty in a culturally nuanced way allows you to create that messaging that's both authentic to the brand and empathetic and engaging to the consumers. We talked a lot about culture, and it's not something that we do in a vacuum at all. Certainly, cultural knowledge helps brands travel across different cultures, however we're defining culture, whether that's country to country or region or demographic or segmentation based. But the way that we do that is to look at kind of a couple of inputs, and how we look at those and which ones we look at kind of depend a lot on the context of what needs to be done. But those include things like market and understanding the category dynamics and environment, the brand itself and the competitors maybe that the brand is facing. And then, with an advertising message, we would also look at context quite specifically in terms of, tone and format and semiotics and things of that nature. And we look at those things from a variety of sources. So it may be past work that's been done. It could be from secondary sources or from stakeholder interviews or empirical models that we have. Certainly we have a framework that we use when we examine culture. And we use all of that to kind of profile cultures and develop a playbook for action. One of the core pieces that we use as well is a global network of cultural curators. And these are people who, again, are physically in these markets and in these locations, who have experience not only with the culture itself, but with categories and trends and understanding how they impact the world and how people are kind of responding to what's going on around them. So that we have again, they've served this role of cultural intelligence advisory to make sure that we're understanding exactly how a message is going to be received and what are the things that we need to look at as potentially, watch outs or places where we should maybe action even more. And that helps to make sure, again, that relevance is there, not only for the brand, but for the culture that the brand is trying to reach and communicate to. And we do that by mapping also against these kind of cultural pillars. And if you have ever looked at cultural understanding before or have a background in this, you probably know that there are a lot of different frameworks and ways that this can be done. Hofstede is one that exists, that's been out there for a while, and we looked across those, a lot of those, too many to even count and mention all of them by name. But we looked at those and then also took and added in kind of this marketing communications overview as well. So we said, what is it that kind of crosses multiple of the analysis that have been done that are really core? And then what's also going to be core for brands that they're going to need to know? And that led us to this kind of dimension of culture that has 4 key areas that then have vectors under them. And those 4 key areas here are contextuality, aspiration, relationship, and locus of control. And we start to then plot out cultures against these in terms of low manifestation and a high manifestation. And low and high in this case, I wouldn't take that to be good and bad, right? It's just where you are on the kind of continuum in terms of the things that underpin these 4 core areas as we look at the importance of culture. And as an example, we have looked at, in the US, it's our cultural profile for those of you in the United States, and thinking about the quality of individualism, right? Which is one of kind of the core, deeply rooted values that shape our culture. And so you can see it plays out differently in terms of the different areas. And again, that idea of individualism, as we referred earlier, is under the relationship kind of vector and pillar. And then we look at different areas and plot where might the US be against these. And that helps us to understand as we're looking at things like brand positioning or a communications piece, how is it going to then map out against these as well? How might people interpret and personalize and internalize what we're sharing with them? So this gives you kind of an overview of a country example. And I should say too, when we do this, this is a unique lens or a unique view that gives you just the US. And typically when we're doing this, we're doing it in relationship to something else, some other culture. And in this case, I would think of it as we're doing it in relationship to other countries. So we think about where is the US if we think about the globe and in talking with other countries and our other curators. But it could be that we do it in different ways. So again, as we talked earlier, it's not just about country. It can also be about geographic regions within a country. So again, if you think about the US is a very large, very diverse place. And so we took it a step further in this example and said, okay, if we understand the US on individualism, what does it mean if we look at, in this case, census regions? So that's how we got to these different areas. So apologies if you feel like you shouldn't be where you are on this map in terms of region. We strictly defaulted to census because I know it's even a question, right, for all of us, what is the Midwest and who makes that up? But in this case, again, using kind of those regions, we went and did that examination of individualism and how it plays out in terms of some of the imagery that we see or in terms of the words that represent it. And Jeff did some of this work, so I'm going to let him add some context to it as well.
Sure. Hi, everyone. So I think just a couple things to add to this, and then we'll get into an example of a global cultural curation. But what was interesting here, if you look at some of the values and cultural perspectives that start to emerge in these different regions, it is really helpful to think about maybe why a brand might resonate really well in a certain part of the country and maybe not as well in other parts. There could be implications for even casting or the different environments you might show or tweaking certain messaging. I know I'm also a qualitative researcher, so I'm constantly on the ground talking to people in different markets about their perceptions and reactions to different branding positioning or campaigns, depending on what it is. So for something like the West, where we see a lot about the pioneering spirit, we'll look at things and think about things like, you know, the sort of migration over to the West, the entrepreneurship, Silicon Valley. There's certain things that have really formed some of these cultural manifestations that we see in these different regions of the country. Or let's say, for example, the Northeast, where we see a lot of self-determination, competitiveness, direct, quote unquote, direct communication, and things like corporate headquarters are often located in the Northeast. So you start to see different trends and certain themes that start to emerge as you start looking at the cultural factors and kind of even blending it with some of the more sort of qualitative insights that you might gather during research. And since we're talking about COVID-19, I think one interesting perspective that we could kind of help bring this to life is when we think about the Northeast, for example, the idea of this aspiration, the self-determination, competitiveness, directness that you see in the Northeast, it scores really high on this area of that cultural dimension. And it also scores high in terms of locus of control, which is another dimension of taking control of your life and feeling like you need to be more of a determinant of your outcomes. So if we think about sort of mask wearing and how people are responding to the COVID-19 pandemic, you know, if we think about what is it about New York that I think the last statistic was like 80 or 90% of people are wearing masks, which is a really high number considering the millions and millions of people, for example, in the New York City metro area. And one of the things that's really important for us when we're looking at these different cultural dimensions is not just look at them in isolation, but look at the other ones as well, because they can definitely impact and influence why we're seeing a certain behavior manifest. So for something like mask wearing, if we think about, we've got something like the aspirational, where people might be more risk-taking, and that's something you might associate with the Northeast. But you're also dealing with a culture, an area where there's tons of people who are busy, it's very crowded, people are moving around, there's just a lot going on, it's fast-paced. And one of the things we also see in the Northeast on one of the cultural dimensions is what's called uncertainty avoidance. And what uncertainty avoidance is this tendency for people to reduce a sense of uncertainty they feel, this desire to control that more and reduce that. So when we think about mask wearing and things like that, we actually find that New Yorkers are probably, and they are going to be more willing to actually be told what authorities tell them. So where you might think that something might more related to another country, even like Robin was showing, like Japan versus the US, actually we start to see more of a movement along the dimension towards sort of following more of an authority figure and being more willing to listen, wear the masks, because of these different cultural factors and dimensions when we look at them more holistically, versus maybe the Southeast, where you're starting to see more protests and more people not really willing to wear the masks. And when you think of it from a cultural perspective, on the Southeast, a lot about the individual and individual freedom and traditional values are also really important in that area of the country. So I think we need to be really careful about some of these simplistic reasons that we say, oh, these people don't wear masks or these people do. There's really fundamental cultural reasons that drive some of these behaviors. And I think that's something that we really, really value doing, because it does help get beyond some of these perceptions that you can easily make if you just ask the question. But we find when you get to this cultural perspective, you can get to those deeper understandings of why something's happening. Yeah, stop there.
And so we've walked through then an example of country and then regions within a country. We also wanted to give you a quick look at a generational example. And this has been kind of called down because it was used for a project that we did. But we will oftentimes take generations and kind of, again, map them against these different kind of cultural areas and think about what are the distinctions, what's different for Gen X versus millennials, specifically in this example. And again, in understanding those differences and those nuances, we can see the areas where we may need to pay a little more attention or adjust the messaging or adjust adjust how we are positioning the brand to make sure that it's appealing to both groups. And again, it's not about flattening it out so it just works for everybody. It's about making sure that we're hitting the drivers for both so that it has impact for everyone. And in this case, again, we talked earlier about, I think you saw the previous example where there were multiple kind of vectors within each of these areas, but we adjust that based on the needs of what we are, the question that we're attempting to answer in the particular challenge of the brand. So in this case, they're kind of collapsed down into fewer because those are where we saw kind of the core distinctions and the areas where we could look at examples that would help us make changes that would result in the desired outcome that the brand had. So again, just to remind you that it's not just about country and or subcultures within a country. It can be about generations or demographics or other groups as well when we talk about culture. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Jeff to walk you through a specific case study that's focused on the communication area. So Jeff?
All right. So one of the things that we were working on a project for was how do we ensure successful transferability of a current and future global ad campaign? You know, one of the biggest challenges for global campaign development is, you know, how do you get a big idea, or how do you even develop a big idea that's going to travel well to different markets? So some of the things that we wanted to do was really to provide direction for our clients around how to develop creatives that are going to be successful in more than one country. And this could be before the creative brief or after for optimization. We wanted to provide, you know, this is the kind of information you should be paying attention to. So just to ensure your global and local markets are successful. And think about how to flex the campaign a bit to adapt it to the different markets. And ultimately, let's feed the brief to the agency for future global campaigns and helping optimize some of these current campaigns and understand what's going on in terms of why some are performing really well, why some aren't performing really well. We saw a lot of campaigns that were doing excellent in certain markets and just diving in other markets and just not executing well and not resonating. And you know, you can look at the numbers and you get a sense and you can talk about it, but when you start to look at some of the cultural dimensions, there's sort of an aha moment, and you're like, oh, and you start to really understand what's driving some of these reactions and numbers and performance metrics. So before we go to the next slide, I just want to give you a sense of a process we might use for this specific initiative. But we go through a multi-phase process, and for here, what we typically do is we'll do a cultural scan of the dimensions that might impact a category. So, for example, an OTC client, over-the-counter client, and you know, they want to understand what are some of these cultural dimensions that are most relevant, most important to an OTC category, and looking at it from that perspective first. So what we do is we go through the cultural dimensions, we do a scan, and we identify the cultural dimensions across each country and prioritize those dimensions that we feel are most salient, most relevant, are going to have the biggest impact on perceptions of the category, and in particular for the OTC category. Now, what we do in terms of successfully doing this across markets, what's great about Ipsos, and I've been at the company about a year, and what I would say one of the things I love about it most is the global cultural experts we have on the ground in so many countries that we can provide cultural experts in each market and all have strong backgrounds in cultural anthropology, sociology, and part of our role is to continually conduct cultural trends analysis on an ongoing basis where we live. We need to be interfacing with consumers, whether it's online, hopefully soon face-to-face, and really speaking to them and being in close contact with consumers and just being those cultural anthropologists on the ground for each of our respective markets. Because when we do a project, you're not going to have one person from one market do it. We're going to bring together a team who's an expert in each of those countries. And, you know, sometimes we even bring on certain consumers to be your cultural anthropologists on the ground. There's lots of different ways we approach it, but we definitely sometimes like to treat the, you know, consumers are, you know, can be co-researchers and our cultural anthropologists and provide us really unique perspectives as well. So then, keeping on this slide for a bit, when you see these different sort of characteristics, these different dimensions, what we did next for this project in particular is we started to identify these what we call market manifestations or cultural manifestations. And these are daily life advertisements, common phrases, symbols, rituals that manifest in each country. So you can start to see how this dimension comes to life in people's everyday lives, really get a sense of what it looks like, provide proof points. This is real. We're not just making this up. This is manifesting in the culture. We're seeing it. This is what it looks like. Here are some of the slogans you might hear, and kind of bring that to life in terms of how it relates to the category. Not always, but usually towards the category. What are some of these dimensions looking like? And sometimes you might show videos as well to kind of make it a little bit more exciting also. For the next step, and then I'll get into just a quick example to kind of help bring this to life too. If we go to the next slide, after we do all of this, we took the step back, we've done a lot of work to make sure we get into the right cultural dimensions, and then let's do a diagnostic. And for this, we wanted to do a diagnostic of the client's current ad campaigns and previous ad campaigns. And they wanted to start understanding and just really get a sense of what are we doing right and what can we be doing better. And let's look across our different markets across the globe to understand why we're performing really well with certain ads, not performing well, and get a sense of what's happening so we can start, one, making tweaks, and two, for this particular initiative, they were coming out with this big global ad campaign that actually was expanding from 6 markets to 12. Doesn't by any means have to be that big, but it was a really big initiative. So we really need to make sure we got this right. And we really wanted to understand, okay, we need to figure out what's going on in terms of like I said, what's performing well, why isn't it, or what's performing on par, and get a sense of it. At Ipsos, there's actually a quote unquote library, I guess you could call it, that we have CEI, I think it's called Copy Effect Index, where we actually have numbers across thousands of advertisements that we use depending on the project, where we reference, we can look at different ads in different categories. We collect for our current clients all their ads, and we have numbers to look at those. And that's always a great starting point, just to get a sense of where is the baseline, what are the numbers, how are the different ads performing against these certain metrics. So that's the quant side, a little bit of piece, just something I just wanted to mention that sometimes we bring in. And then what we did here is we looked at, okay, what are the cultural dimensions we've identified earlier? And looking at this ad, let's pull out the ones that are really the ones that are most likely driving and impacting reactions to the ad, and really understand what it is that's happening. So we didn't get into too much detail here. I'll just give one example here in terms of let's look at closeness relationship in the analysis. In this one, the US scored very high, Brazil scored medium, Germany didn't score so well. So let's just look at closeness as an example of one dimension. And closeness is about how comfortable you feel. You want to have personal space versus being more of a fusion with others. So closeness is on that spectrum of how acceptable it is to be closer versus more distance from others. So for this ad, for example, it's a woman, she's not feeling well, she takes a cold medication when she's home, then she gets on a train, going to work, she's feeling confident, she's like, all right, I'm ready to tackle the day, bring me on, let's go. And the numbers on how this performs were really starkly different. And when we did the cultural analysis, what we learned when we look at even just one of them for closeness, for the US, this actually worked really well in terms of the desire for freedom, personal space, wanting to feel that sense of I can achieve my goals, I want to get out there, I want to keep moving. So it resonated with consumers a lot. When you look at comparing it to, let's say, Germany, this brought up a lot of discomfort for Germans, in particular for this project, And if you think about it, what it is around Germans show a higher hygienic behavior. Showing a person needing the OTC to get on public transport in front of around a lot of people, whether it's infecting others or you being around those people, it's just the wrong context. So it just didn't perform well. And that's not something that we had a sense of, but it doesn't necessarily come out in the numbers, but it really helps explain to brand managers, marketing insights, any other sort of internal stakeholders involved in building the brand and communications, understand, here's sort of the factors that have guided success, whether it's looking at current campaigns or for the future. Here are the cultural dimensions to be keeping in mind and focusing on, and direction, getting guardrails, and then also just more fodder for ad agencies in general, whether it's creative or planners. I used to be a planner in ad agencies for years, and I can tell you this is the kind of stuff that they love and don't give you the stink eye if you're sharing this kind of content. So I will stop there. Yes.
Thanks, Jeff, for sharing that example with us. So we wanted to kind of go back and summarize why culture matters and why brands need to explore culture, not only in a time of crisis where it becomes kind of even a stronger driver and help in terms of understanding what's going on, but also beyond. And there are three kind of core reasons. It's knowing those drivers and dimensions that define cultural identity become important, right? If you can understand those, again, you can start to impact and action and get and impact actions that people are taking. It also helps you to understand the role your brand can play in helping people cope with uncertainty in a culturally nuanced way, which is particularly important in a time of crisis, but it's important always, right? Always what we're trying to do is help consumers solve a challenge or a problem or help them kind of resolve a question. So it's always critical and always helpful if you can do that in a specific way that applies to them. It also helps to build authenticity and simplicity in your engagement with consumers. Again, that becomes even more important in a time of crisis, but it's not unimportant all of the time. The more authentic you are, the more quickly people can internalize and understand the message, the better it's going to be for what you're trying to achieve. And with that, we'll turn to the Q&A. Someone who's been monitoring that for us. So, Jeff?
Yes, so a question that came in. So one of the questions was, how can I get my marketing partners to buy into the findings?
So my top line example, and then I'll let Jeff go too, is I think one of the core things that we focus on with any type of curation we do, and certainly with cultural curation as well, is about focusing on activation. And so what we will try and do is understand who exactly is going to need the output that we're working on, what's going to be core for them in terms of actionability and understanding what needs to happen. And we do that in large part by providing very specific action steps and examples that support that. So not to keep this at a theoretical kind of level, but to give real life examples so that people can internalize them and understand what needs to happen and then action against them.
All right, I think we have time for one more question. I'm just going to go to the next one just so we can cover another one. How do we decide which cultures to look at when we have a need? So for example, a branding or communication issue.
So again, I would say it depends on the specifics of the brand question and issue. If it's one about global, certainly probably we know the countries that are going to be most important, but we will also work with you, right? If you have to approach 12 countries, it may not be feasible to do an analysis across all 12. And so we'll work with you in terms of what might be most representative in a certain region or certain area so that we can, again, reapply across across multiple countries and cultures. And then it also it's about the project and where is the most opportunity for the brand in terms of that understanding then having impact. So we've done projects before where we have gone in actually kind of understanding we need to look at something that has to do with reinventing how we shelve, for example, but we don't know exactly what cultures we're going to look at until we start to look at where are the outages and what's not resonating. And we can start to say, okay, here's where the outages are. And so we're going to go to a more generational focus, or it's a regional focus. And so we will work with you kind of on that question up front to understand really where are the biggest opportunities and the biggest areas of impact that we can have to help the brand move forward.
So we have one more question. I'm conscious of the time. Do we want to take one more, Robin?
Sure, if people can stick with us.
This is another interesting one in terms of, the question is why India and Brazil have high anxiety rates. I think you touched on this a little bit, but that was another question that came through.
Sure. So again, it's going to depend in part, I think, on the point of time where things are happening and what's going on. But it may also, again, be about not just that they have high anxiety, but they're less comfortable with the anxiety that they have. So in some cultures, again, there's that sense of I don't really need to know what's around the corner, but in others, there is that kind of bigger drive to I want to know what's happening now and next. And so we would look at that again across all of those vectors to kind of identify what is it that's driving specifically in those regions, but that's probably one of the things that's underlying it. And I apologize, I don't have both of those kind of profiles in front of me to tell you specifically, but I believe we know who sent the question, so we will get back to you more specifically on that.
Awesome. I think that's it for now. Let's see.
I really want to thank Robin and Jeff, both of you, for today's interesting presentation. And thank you everyone for joining us today. If we didn't get to your question, then we will do so by email. You will also receive an email with a direct link to today's recorded presentation. And of course, we welcome the opportunity to speak with you, so please feel free to reach out to us. That now concludes today's webinar. Have a wonderful day.